Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Found this old 486, but it doesn't want to boot. Let's see what it takes to get it up and running again. At first glance, this is just an ordinary looking 486 computer, right? It's beige, it's got a 5 1/4 and 3.5 floppy drive, it's got a turbo button, nothing too out of the ordinary, but you get a little bit closer into the details on this machine and it starts to paint a little bit of a different picture. First thing that I noticed is the tape drive, this Colorado tape drive. Most regular workstation kind of computers during this era didn't have a tape drive in them. So what's going on with that? The other thing, and this raises an even bigger question for me, is centered around this case badge. It says Humphrey Instruments, a division of Zeiss Incorporated. Well, Zeiss, if you're familiar with that name, you most likely associate it with things like camera lenses. But that's a company that has roots in all sorts of optical instruments, and one of their major divisions is medical equipment, specifically equipment centered around eye exams, ophthalmology kind of equipment, that stuff. So this machine definitely wasn't some regular PC that someone did like Excel spreadsheets on. I think it had a bit of a different life. Now, I did some digging into this whole Humphrey Instruments thing. I'm trying to figure out kind of when this machine came about, like when it was built, what it was used for, because, well, computational archaeology I think is really interesting, especially with machines from this era, trying to figure out like, you know, what new technology they were starting to see themselves get used for. And so the medical profession, I think, in that late 80s, early 90s field is when we started to see more computers getting used, and Humphrey Instruments, well, apparently they were originally owned by a company called Allergan, and I found a newspaper article from 1991, I think it was the LA Times, that talked about how Humphrey had gotten sold off to Zeiss. So that at least kind of dates when this machine was built. It had to have been at least 1991, if not later, because otherwise it would have had a different badge on the front. But if we flip the machine around, there's some other interesting stuff going on here too. Now from the back, this is kind of normal looking. I mean, you've got typical power supply. This is an AT-based computer. It's a 486, so it's got an AT keyboard port, things like serial ports, parallel ports, but then you get to this port. I have no idea what this port does. It looks very different than typical ports that you'd see on computers from the era. It kind of reminds me of some of those specialized video connectors. I'm trying to remember where I originally saw these. Maybe it was like Silicon Graphics workstations or something like that for high quality video, but it doesn't have as much pins in it for that kind of use. So I'm curious as to what that was all about. So further down the back, the machine again is both familiar and a little bit different. You've got this fan grate, which I can only assume is one of those PCI slot, well, it's not even PCI, whatever, card slot fan sort of add-in devices. You've got this video card. I can only assume it's the video card because it's got a 15-pin D-sub on there, but it's also got this 9-pin port. What would that have been used for? You've got what looks like a PS2 add-in card. Okay, that's typical enough, but there's also a modem. If this was used for medical purposes, what would a modem be necessary for? I really want to get inside this machine and try and figure out what's going on because I suspect the hardware may tell a very interesting tale. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself tearing this thing down, I should probably show you what that problem is that I referred to at the beginning of the video, how the machine doesn't want to boot. In order to get it set up, I need a keyboard. Now, when I first got the machine, I figured I would need to get an adapter because I don't have any AT keyboards. So I picked up one of these. It's one of those simple AT to PS2 keyboard adapters. I got it from Free Geek. If you watched that episode from a few weeks back, you may remember this. But I was talking with the coworker who originally found this machine going out for e-waste and mentioned, you know, hey, I don't have a keyboard for this thing. I'd love to get the machine up and running, and dug out this, the original keyboard. This thing is so incredibly cool because I've never seen a 60% sized AT keyboard before. I've seen plenty of full-sized ones, and I think I've even seen some 10 keyless ones, but this one's even more compact. You know, keyboards from like the 80s and early 90s and stuff generally were really well built. This one was manufactured by a company called BTC. I've never heard of them, maybe you have, but I got to thinking, you know, hey, I could use this as like a daily driver kind of keyboard. I love these small keyboards. I love really good mechanical key feel and all that. So I'm thinking, oh, I could get like an adapter going because it's a native AT keyboard. Then I started actually typing on it and, well, I got a lot less excited. Yeah, it's just rubber dome, which is a big bummer. I was hoping for mechanical key switches, something like, you know, the Alps, those really classic kind of Alps clicky keys, but yeah, not so much. So this keyboard isn't quite as high end as I was hoping, but even still, it's super cool. I'm definitely going to keep it for if I run across other old computers, and it just leads even more information to this whole story as to just what in the hell this computer was used for. Yeah, I know. I'm using a flat panel display. It's all I've got. This machine didn't come with an original CRT, or at least I don't think anyone was able to find one. I don't have a stock of CRT monitors. I don't have room for them. So I'm using a flat panel display with an adapter, whatever. You'll get over it. It's fine. It's going to be fine. Okay, let's power it on and see what happens. Invalid EISA configuration storage. That's one of the errors it comes back with. Looks like it's got, wait for it to finish the RAM test again, 8 megs of RAM, so that's exciting. And here's the other thing that I would get. Invalid configuration information, please run setup program. I have an idea as to what's going on with that, but let's let it kind of keep going. I should also note this machine, yeah, floppy drive check, this machine doesn't have a hard drive in it. I don't think anyone was ever able to get it to recognize the hard drive or even boot to a floppy. So ultimately, the drive got pulled out and is getting sent off for getting shredded, which I understand it from the security perspective. The drive just needed to get wiped and or shredded. In this case, it had to get shredded. It's fine. I'll figure out a hard drive solution for this machine another day. Right now, my main goal is to just get it to boot off of a floppy, which it's having difficulty doing. So after it goes through the floppy drive check, you get to this point. I'm going to go ahead and hit F2 and show you what it comes back with. It's that first error that kind of explains it all. Clock chip lost power. I'm not surprised that the CMOS battery in this machine would be bad after however long it's been, potentially 25 plus years. But you can see, like, these default settings are just wrong. Disk A is a 5.25 360K drive. No, this is more than that. There's no B drive listed, although I've got a 3.5 floppy. It says there's a hard drive in here. There's not. And then the big tell as to the fact the battery is dead is, well, look at the date and time. It says it's January 1st, 1990. What's also interesting is there's this add-in controller card too. Well, stop beeping at me. We'll see what's going on with that as well. This whole separate GSI BIOS thing. But anyway, I've got a FreeDOS floppy that I made up here and hit F1 to retry. See, it doesn't want to boot, and I suspect that's due to the whole bad CMOS battery. See, these machines are from an era before settings, like even low-level settings in the BIOS, were stored on persistent flash. It was stored in what's effectively a RAM chip, and that RAM chip kept its settings because of the CMOS battery. So the CMOS battery wasn't just for keeping date and time, it was actually keeping all the low-level config settings. So if the battery dies, obviously you lose all those settings. The thing that sucks is even if I go into the setup utility and set up everything correctly in there, like in terms of the floppy drives, and then reboot the machine like a warm boot, it still doesn't keep the settings. So that clock battery has to work even if the machine has AC power. So we need to get into the hardware on this one and figure out what's going on with that clock battery. Hopefully it's a standard type. I actually haven't popped the cover on this machine yet. I've just kind of goofed around in software a little bit. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on. Okay. Sitting on the floor again here. Kind of reminded me of when I was a little kid playing with Lego. Anyway, let's get this cover taken off, shall we? I think it's going to be easier just working on this machine up on the table. Anyway, what a nightmare this cabling is. Like, I understand that computers were way less integrated back then, but it's like whoever built this machine did no cable management at all. So it's going to be hard to work in this machine to find that clock battery and swap it out. And I certainly can't show you where it is if I've got all these cables and everything in the way. So let's just take all this out. We'll pull all the cards out too, and then we can go through each of those and see, you know, what they are and if they're any good. And then we'll find that clock battery and maybe try to reassemble this thing in a little bit cleaner of a fashion, perhaps. I dropped a screw. So that's one mystery partially solved. This is what's hooked up to that weird port on the back of the computer. It's just got 3 wires going into it. This green ground wire, which hooks up to the chassis, and then positive and negative that go into a Molex connector to hook up to the power supply in the computer. This looks like a fuse holder. There's like no indications of any data or anything going through that port. So it's like they only used it to power some piece of equipment that was hooked up to this whole machine. Very bizarre. Good old socket 3 here, 486 of some sort. Not entirely sure which model it is. It's got a Cooler Master CPU fan on here. Yes, Cooler Master existed back in the early 90s. They're a surprisingly old company. Yeah, the heatsink isn't clipped down to the socket, so let's some of these wires out of the way. And it's just this retention arm on the side. Let's see if we can get any info off the bottom of the chip here. Best guess is that this is a 486 DX2. That I66 mark on there is kind of what gives it away, and the fact that it's got a heatsink. So this is definitely very late 486 era. This motherboard was manufactured by a company called Micronix Computers. They were apparently fairly prolific back in the 80s and early 90s. Unfortunately, I can't find a ton of information about this particular board online. Can't find the owner's manuals or anything like that. I was able to find one page that listed like the jumper settings for the CPU, but nothing in terms of, you know, system architecture or the BIOS settings or anything like that. Apparently Micronix got acquired around 1998 by Diamond Multimedia. They'd fallen on hard times, so towards the later part of the 90s apparently was when their best was behind them. There's this battery that appears to be soldered to the motherboard, but then there's also this thing. And this is actually a very common thing from this era. I was kind of expecting to see this. This is a real-time clock chip with integrated battery. Instead of using a separate like coin cell battery like you'd normally see on computers these days, during this time period, I guess to save costs and to make things more simple, they used these devices where it's got the real-time clock and the battery is built into it. It's like an expendable lithium battery. It's not rechargeable. The thing that sucks though is you can't replace the battery independently of the clock chip. So when the battery in this dies, you're sunk. You have to replace this entire unit. Where I'm confused is what's going on with this battery next to it. Let's grab the multimeter and see maybe if this battery is dead too. That might explain why this machine can't keep any settings. So a quick diversion here. As luck would have it, the batteries in my meter died and decided to start leaking. Great. So I've got some cotton swabs, cotton buds, whatever you want to call them, soaked in isopropanol here. And let's see if we can't clean this up. All right, got it cleaned up. Brand new batteries in here. I guess I just have to remember to take these out when I'm not using the meter. Oh well. That battery says 3.6 volts on it. Let's see what it actually is. Huh. It's apparently still good. That's weird. So here's something I just noticed. It looks like this battery was hand soldered in there. Look at how bad of a job that was. They might have even soldered the battery to the board with it in the case. So was this some sort of field repair, maybe to get around the dead battery in the clock chip? I mean, if that's the case, then it implies this machine was used for far longer than I originally expected, given the low wear on the keyboard and how relatively clean it is inside this machine. And even then, that begs the question of, like, why is the machine still reporting CMOS clock battery problems with a battery in here that has the correct reported voltage? I mean, according to the meter, this battery is fine. Maybe this board doesn't support it? Oh, so strange. I kind of can't believe it, but I went digging through my parts bin and I found this. It's the same model of clock chip. I mean, it's a slight revision, but I did a quick search and apparently this is just a drop-in replacement for the clock chip that's already in there. I don't remember when I bought this. It's in a package, so it's got to be new. There's got to be at least some life left in it. I imagine it's fairly recent. The date code suggests manufactured in 2016. Is that right? The 31st week of 2016? Anyway, let's just drop this in there and see what we get. And let's look at the date code on this chip. 37th week of 1994. I can't believe this chip was replaced at some point. I mean, it's possible, but assuming this is the original clock chip in this computer, that means this thing dates to probably 1995? Interesting that they would have gone with a 486 at that point. I mean, Windows 95 had come out. I wonder what OS this thing ran. Really makes me wish I had the hard drive. Anyway, let's get this chip pulled out. It looks like it's in a socket. Sorry, my hand was on the way on that one. Old chip out. Hopefully the new one goes in a little more easily. There we go. So let's go through some of these cards that were in that machine, huh? This is a standard ISA card. They were all ISA. This is serial and parallel port. You've got serial and parallel on the back, plus you've got some headers internally. This one's parallel, that one is serial. That's where that ribbon cable hooked up to. 486 boards and older, the AT motherboards in general didn't really have anything on board, just the keyboard port, and you kind of had to add everything else through expansion cards like this. So this was a very common thing to see in machines from that era. So next on the list is this fan module. This thing's interesting. It's got these tabs, right? And they're labeled A and B. A is what slots into the ISA slot. I can only assume that you could flip this thing around somehow, and maybe B was for PCI, and then you could just flip the rear cover on here. This thing doesn't look like it does a whole lot of good, but there is dust inside the fans, so maybe it did something. Machines from this era didn't terribly, get hot, so I don't know what practical purpose this card served, especially since it was pointing at the back of the video card, but it certainly made a lot of noise, so I guess there's that. And speaking of the video card, check out this beast. This thing is full length ISA. Apparently it's a Matrox Magic RB card, according to the label on here. I couldn't find much about this specific model, but I did find some stuff about the Magic RGB. I can only assume maybe this was a prior version or a cut down version of it or something. What's particularly interesting is the selection of chips and everything on here. They're from manufacturers that don't really make chips anymore, like these AT&T branded chips. That's curious. This chip has a heatsink on it. I don't remember very many video cards from that era having or needing heat sinks. Not a whole lot going on the back except just a ton of surface mount passives. Look at all of that. But based on what I was able to dig up, what's interesting about this card, not only did it do video out, but apparently was some sort of frame grabber, like a capture card. So that leads some additional questions about just what this computer did. Did it get hooked up to some instrument that would like take pictures? I've got some ideas. We'll cover them towards the end of the video. So my best guess as to what this computer did, but this was apparently a pretty high-end card back in the day. And then from very high-end to very pedestrian, I guess, it's just the PS2 port card that was in there. It's just a standard Microsoft mouse card. Like, these would have come with some of the Microsoft mice that you could buy. So here's the modem, pretty standard looking. Something interesting I noticed on the back as well, manufactured by US Robotics, and they were very prolific during, this time period. They were one of the best known manufacturers of modems and just kind of networking stuff in general. Copyright 1995. So again, more questions. Was this an original part in that computer? If it was, that dates the computer again to at least 1995, which seems awfully late for a 486DX2. Or this was an add-in card later on. Why would they have needed to add a modem? And I guess the other question is, why did they need a modem to begin with? If this was hooked up to some sort of medical instrument, like, what would it need to call out to? Finally, the last card, and this thing is a giant freaking mess. It's this controller card that was down in the bottom. There's nothing externally on it, but it's got these ribbon cables, which I probably should have unhooked, but whatever. I'm dropping everything on the floor. This is what handles the floppy drive and IDE. So here's your standard, parts of the floppy cable for the 5 1/4 and the 3 1/2. That's, obvious, but it's on this like Y cable that apparently, let me see if I can find it, is part of the tape drive thing. It says to floppy data cable, so it's got this connector in the middle of the ribbon. And this end, it says, go to the controller. And then this part of the cable is what goes to the tape drive. So the tape drive hung off of the floppy bus. I would have kind of expected it to come off of IDE, but okay, whatever. I don't have much experience with tape drives from this particular point in time. I mean, I've used modern tape backup setups, but nothing this old. And then it's just a standard IDE ribbon cable, but this is an add-in controller. Again, kind of like that whole, parallel serial port. The motherboard didn't have it on board, so you had to add one in yourself. It's manufactured by a company called GSI. I couldn't find any information on this card, like just at all. All right, well, I got that RTC chip swapped out. That's really the main goal here. So let's get the machine put back together and see if that fixed it. I'm not putting that fan card thing back in. Screw that. It was annoying. All I did was make noise, and I don't think it blew a whole lot of air around. So let's go. Yeah, I realized that I complained earlier on about how messy the cables were, and it's only moderately better now, but if I ever get this machine up and running for good, then I'll tidy it up as best I can. All right, moment of truth, I guess. Let's see what we get now. Oh, without that stupid fan in there, this thing is way quieter. We're still getting that EISA configuration storage error. Not quite sure what's up with that, but hopefully it's not a deal breaker. It got through some of that faster. Let's get into setup. All right, so that's a good sign. The clock battery stuff is all gone. It's just saying incorrect config data. Let's get into this. Oh, too late. I gotta reboot again. I wanna get into that add-on controller card BIOS as well. Curious, does Control Delete work? Oh, it does. F1. Okay, insert. There we go. Yeah, let's fix these floppy settings. For some reason, I think this was set up so that the 5 1/4 was the A drive. Not sure why they would have done that, but anyway. Okay, so new choices. Drive A choice, floppy drive with LED on. Well, what LED is on? They're both on. Did I screw up the cabling somehow? Let me see if I can fix that. So yeah, I don't know what was going on there. Cables are all fine. I'm just going to leave the cover off because, you know, screw it. Let's see what we get now. All right, into here. Let's see what we get now. Yes? Drive A choice. All right. Oh, hey, okay. So now the 3.5 is lit up. Yes. I want that. And that is a type 4. Yes. Still giving me this EISA config storage error. If anyone knows what that's about, let me know, would you? Down in the comments. All right, we're reading off the floppy. Are we getting into FreeDOS? No hard disk detect. Yeah, of course. The drive sounds normal, so I think the drive physically is fine. That's good. I didn't really want to have to take it apart and try to fix it or clean it or whatever. All right. Oh, English. Well, I don't have anything to install this to, so let's go back to DOS. Cool. So we're booted into FreeDOS off the floppy, and it like reads the files off the disk. So yeah, I'm gonna call that a win. All right, so we at least got the initial problem, the whole clock battery thing and saving settings and booting from floppies. We got that all figured out, thankfully. But that still raises questions about, like, just what was this machine used for? What we do know is that there are parts in here with date codes from 1995. And that, of course, raises some big questions. Why would they have been using a 486 in that era? Like, if this was a new machine, assuming that all of the parts in this computer were original to it, which I kind of suspect is the case considering the use of hot glue on cables and such, why would they have gone with a 486 during that era? I mean, when 1995, Windows 95, it was the Pentium era. You could have gotten a much better computer for probably the same amount of money. Why did they go with a 486? Well, I have a theory as to that, and it's because I've dealt with companies that put together what they call turnkey solutions, where they'll send you the computer and all the parts and all the software and everything in one package for whatever kind of device it is. Whether it's an industrial component or some sort of IT thing, or in this case, potentially a medical device, they want to spec everything to a known quantity, right? So they have the people in their engineering department come up with all that special hardware, whatever equipment it was that this PC hooked up to. And then those people also said, okay, so we know for sure that our special equipment will work with a computer that has these specifications. And so the company will build computers themselves or contract another company to build computers to that specification so that they can sell it as that package. Why don't they then keep with technology? And, you know, around this time, why weren't they including Pentium-based computers instead of 486DX2s? Well, that's because requalifying all of that hardware takes time and money. It's a lot easier for them to just keep cranking out these machines. Even though they may not be the latest technology, at least it's a known quantity. It's something that just works. And that comes to some research that I've done. I couldn't find any information about this particular computer and maybe what it was hooked up to specifically, but based on what I've found and kind of tying that together with the parts that are in this machine, my best guess is that this computer was part of some sort of like eye testing system. And that's why there's all the ports on the back, that weird power port that we found, multiple serial ports, parallel port, and then also the reason why it has a video capture card installed in here too. Maybe it was hooked up to a piece of equipment that had a camera in it that was able to, take really detailed pictures of the inside of your eye. Maybe it was hooked up to some sort of eye microscope kind of thing. I don't know. I don't really know much about, optometry, ophthalmology, any of those medical sciences or anything like that. But just based on my experience going to the eye doctor, and you could probably agree because I'm sure you've been to the eye doctor too, with all the various equipment you stick your face into and they look in your eyes and do all that testing, that's my guess. And you know what? In some ways, if this thing really dates from 95 or 96, that's fairly advanced technology. I mean, if you kind of think about it, I'm, trying to remember back, in that era, 95, 96, what was the average eye doctor appointment for me like? And I don't seem to remember it ever involving computers or computerized equipment. So this could have actually been like state of the art for its time, even though the computer hardware itself wasn't really anything to write home about. If you know anything about this machine, if you happen to work in that field or anything like that, please let me know. Hit me up with some comments down below. I'd really like to start to kind of put the pieces together on this machine and be able to say definitively exactly what it was used for. Obviously, there's still some more work that I need to do with this one. I need to get a hard drive solution of some sort hooked up into it. I'm thinking maybe an IDE to compact flash card adapter again, but who knows, maybe I'll find a vintage hard drive that works I can drop in here as well. And then it also comes down to the question of what I'm going to use it for. I mean, a lot of what I could do on this machine, I could just do in virtualization. I mean, if I want to run Windows 3.1 or 95 or something, I can spin up a VM. Granted, it's a bit more fun doing it on original hardware, but it's also got me thinking about all of the other operating systems from the 90s-ish kind of era that maybe flew a little bit more under the radar or that I just didn't have experience with. This might make an interesting system to try those out on. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.